That was fun. They better keep everything on.
Almost as good as starting
That's just because he can't hear
I
you.
can hear it then. I mean, that thing I've heard.
Do you want it? Hand it down.
So I think the one before it was so bad. And I think they'll just.
All right, good afternoon. Welcome everyone to the Board of Trustees meeting for October 23rd, 2024. I'll call the meeting to order, and first item on the agenda is the invocation, and followed by the Pledge of Allegiance, which are going to be conducted by Dr. J. Smith. Please stand.
Bow your heads, please. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for this opportunity to conduct the state's business. Please watch over us, guide us, give us the wisdom that we need, dear Heavenly Father. And it's in your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. We'll move on to approval of the agenda. Board members have the agenda. If
So move.
we could have a motion and a second. Thank you very much. Motion and a second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Next is approval of the minutes from the August 28th, 2024 meeting. Do we have a motion to approve those minutes?
I'll make the motion.
Second. We have a motion and a second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, next we'll move to the report of the Administrative Committee. Mr. Benson?
Mr. Chairman, the hardest working committee of the week met yesterday and today, and still in the process of meeting, but did receive actuarial reports yesterday from Chiron, and some informational things on the Tier 5. But as far as action is concerned, this morning the Administrative Committee approved the board meeting schedule for 2025, which is behind tab C, and I would place that in the form of a motion for approval for next year's board meeting.
Heard the motion from the committee. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Motion and a second. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
The second item that was taken up for approval was the state employee election results. Terrence Yarbrough was certified as the winner by the Administrative Committee, and I would place that in the form of a motion.
I'll second.
We have a motion and a second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed?
The rest of the morning was determined with actuarial projections and evaluations and discussion. But that concludes the report of items that had action taken.
All right, and let me just say congratulations, Mr. Yarbrough, to you. There's a seat right there by Mr. Graham if you want to take it at whatever point. So, or not, wait till next month. So, so we had some unfinished business from the Administrative Committee and it running long, within which, Mr. Benson, if you don't mind, we can go to the next items on the agenda for what I think is conclusion of the additional independent actuarial assessments. I don't know that there was an action, was the acceptance of those
No, I
required?
think,
I know the actuary, our regular actuary CABMAC report would be, but that's the last thing on the agenda I think we'll take before other.
assuming that you all would agree, those things, the independent one and CABMAC would just be information only at this point, so no need for an action.
No need to accept the report or anything of that nature?
No, we were thinking we would do that at a later time, probably in November.
Okay, upon finalization of
Mhm.
all information, okay. Well, then we would just open it up for any continued discussion or any, because I believe CABMAC, Ed and his group were through, other than, okay. We're good for today unless board members, or Mr. Higgins no, you had some
Yeah.
comments about that?
Yes, sir. Do have a few things. As you mentioned, CABMAC is still here, and I think they certainly can adjust if needed, but I think typically they would be planning to leave around 1:30, just for background, but they're happy to stay. Do have a few remarks. One I want to do is kind of just an information item, though. while they're still here and to make sure we don't forget. And in the report, you may have seen, we had a request to run some of the same numbers around 7.5%. So in the sensitivity analysis of their report, in the chart that is very common that we refer to as one of Dr. McCoy's favorite, the numbers are run at 7.55. So I just want to make sure that that information's in there and it's out there and it'll be in the report. As far as my other remarks, some of it's been covered already. I just wanted to say that, as you know, my theme for this year is fund PERS. Fund PERS, support the board, work together. And I certainly hope that we do. Like, for example, on the previously adopted board recommended Tier 5, or in some other areas, such as maybe dedicating some of the surplus revenue toward PERS. So I hope we work together. But I think funding, and I want to work together, but funding absolutely has to be a part has to be a component. And I know that's tough. I know that's hard on the state side and the employer side. But as actuaries, as has been indicated earlier this morning, it's our role and our job to make those recommendations. And at this point, as you've heard, even though I know it's the preliminary results and draft reports, but we have now heard from 3 top-tier actuarial firms that are very experienced in working with public pensions similar to PERS of Mississippi throughout the country. And all 3, we have similar results from last year, and the results, in my opinion, essentially verify and validate what the board has said or done before and what the consulting actuary has recommended before. And again, all 3 come in with similar results that have an actuarial determined contribution rate of approximately 26% of payroll. So I think it's important that we consider that. I also want to say that, as I understood it, I completely agree with something that Dr. McCoy stated earlier about the implementation of any potential future rate increases. And that's one thing I want to go ahead and mention to the board in future meetings, probably in November. I will very likely be recommending some changes to the board's funding policy. In some ways, just to update it for recent changes in the law, and in other ways to move toward an ADEC policy or an actuarial determined contribution policy. So very likely we'll be recommending changes to the funding policy to update for recent changes and moving toward an ADEC policy. And I think we should consider that for a variety of reasons. At this point, it would be clear, and PERS is complex. It's a complex issue with a lot of moving parts that may streamline it and clarify that. We'd still certainly do all the other metrics and projections and all the other numbers, but from a recommendation standpoint, very likely we'll be recommending the actuarial determined contribution from our consulting actuary that has been essentially supported and verified by the 2 independent actuarial assessments, and recommending moving toward that ADEC policy. But I said that also to say this, and going back to agreeing with what Dr. McCoy said earlier, I think we should consider that for a variety of reasons, but one of the main ones at this point is to be consistent with recent changes in the law. Because at this point, the law change, before the PERS as a board and system, the board would have to consider implementation and phase in and all the parameters around that. But at this point, as I understand it, now that the law has been changed, the actual implementation of any rate increases or funding increases or employer contribution increases are the sole authority of the legislature. So given that, we need to update our funding policy, and we respect that. I mean, we certainly respect that as a prerogative of the legislature, and it is a very important and impactful issue that affects a lot of entities statewide. So we understand that. But given that, I think that's all the more reason that from our standpoint, given we have received the recommendation from 3 independent top-tier actuarial firms, that we would recommend that, because like Dr. McCoy said, the implementation of it is up to the legislature. And I'd be happy to answer any questions on that, but I wanted to comment just a little bit about that, with funding being the need. And again, let me say again something I said earlier. For those maybe watching or listening, PERS is certainly stable. We have $35 billion in assets. People can continue to count on their benefits. As Senator Sparks has said, not to speak for any of y'all or put words in your mouth, there's not been this issue. PERS is stable. People can count on their benefits. We just have to work together to keep it that way. And it's more of a long-term conversation, but the time for the conversation is now. With that, I'd be happy to answer any questions. But I wanted to recap some of that about the funding need and state my most likely intention to recommend changes to the funding policy for you all to consider at a future meeting.
I got a question real quick, just for my educational purposes. Who pays for the actuaries now?
So the ones you've heard from in the last 24 hours, PERS paid for. We have CAVMAC as our regular actuary, consulting actuary, and then the two additional ones, PERS paid
So
for
we
these.
paid for that out of pocket?
Or from the system fund,
From
our
system,
budget, from our
out of
budget.
pocket.
the system.
So, and we didn't get appropriated that, right?
Not any additional appropriations. It was from our regular system administrative budget that goes through the appropriations process.
And they all said the same thing,
Something very similar.
and so we paid extra money, and I really, it was educational, and I loved it, but we paid money for the same answer.
That the results were similar. I can understand where you're coming from.
All right.
Yeah, and I think what Ray's saying, technically, the legislature appropriates all the authority
Sure.
to spend money to PERS, and
Yeah.
they paid it out of authority that was appropriated.
That's
within
right, out of our
their fiscal
regular
year.
budget.
That's right.
Yeah.
So really just the big suggestion here is, in the role change, so to speak, from the board's perspective, at least modifying, or some suggestions from you to kind of modify that to give, basically for deference to the legislature now that the board's not really the determiner, they're not the determiner, if you will, of that rate, just to change that to be appropriate based on this past year's legislation.
That is definitely
Mainly.
part of it and the majority of it. Not the total reason, because there's also the recommendation to move toward an ADEC policy. But in this case, we wouldn't be able to implement it anyway because of what you just said.
Right, yeah, and so the only part of that discussion that I wanted to add to earlier, whenever we were running along, is us just being really close with discussions with the legislature and their leadership, especially on what they may need. Not that they couldn't directly ask for that, but of course, we want to be responsive to what they may need, and seeing that, again, some of these numbers may be idealistic from the actuarial perspective because they have liability in what they're recommending. But if we need to ask them for something, we can certainly do that with direct request from the legislature, or with them directly doing it to the actuaries, or through us.
Sure.
To make sure that they have all the information they're going to need for their members, who are going to continue to ask a lot of questions about it, and make sure that their constituents retirements continue like they are to be stable.
Yep.
So,
Absolutely. And we'll work with them and help any way we can. Yeah.
So, technical adjustments, other things like what we proposed last year to the legislature, are we gonna be talking about that in the, November meeting as to whether we're gonna bring those items back to the legislature, the ones that are outside of what we've been talking about? Other things that were not approved from the legislature, we still have to carry to the legislature anything that would require a change in law. That's what we had done. Is that?
That is definitely correct. Any of the changes would have to go to the legislature. But to the point about discussing it, yes, we could in November, but if agreeable, I hope to mention it some in just a minute when we get to the legislative committee section of the board. I was going to
Okay.
give an update like we would have done in committee.
Okay, that'll be fine.
any further comments related to the continuation of the administrative committee meeting?
If not, Mr. Chairman, that concludes the administrative committee for the day.
All right, thank you, Mr. Benson. We will move on to the report of the Defined Contribution Committee. Dr. Rutledge?
Yep, the Defined Contribution Committee met yesterday, and there was no action taken that required board approval, but we did hear from the ORP vendors for their annual reviews, Corebridge, TIAA, and FOIA. But again, no action that requires board approval.
Just more confirmation for Mr. Benson that that's not the hardest working committee. Okay, thank you, Dr. Rutledge. We will move on to the report of the Investment Committee. Dr. McCoy?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The investment committee did meet yesterday. There was no action taken in the investment committee that requires action of the board. However, We did meet for a lengthy time yesterday, and we received a market update and performance review from Callan. And as of September 30th, 2024, the assets of the PERS was $35.3 billion, which is an increase of $1.6 billion over the previous quarter. As of Friday, October the 18th, the fiscal year to date PERS total fund was up 5.11%, and that was really highlighted by real estate, and the economic conditions has been such that the real estate market has turned around, and that did positively impact us. We also, in the afternoon, heard reports from 4 fixed income managers. Loomis, for the last 12 months, their returns were up 12.51%. We heard from Manulife, they were up 12.54% for the last year. And they have actually outperformed their benchmark since the inception of us hiring them as a manager. PIMCO, who has been a manager for us for 41 years, their returns were up 12.93% over the last year. And then Prudential was up 13.72% for the last 12 months. A positive report from our fixed income managers. We appreciate their work. And Mr. Chairman, since there's no action to be presented, that completes the investment committee report.
Thank you, Dr. McCoy. Sounded like a lot of justification for being the second hardest working committee at least. And then we'll move on to the report of the legislative committee, which I'll qualify also, Mr. Dale. That's right, but we're about to do it right now. So in lieu of meeting earlier, which we ran out of time, we'll just have that meeting during this meeting and turn it over to you for it to happen in real time.
There were two bills that would be resubmitted or submitted to the legislature for sure, that there's some changes to some language, and Mr. Higgins probably will have some report of other issues that may be legislative matters to be presented.
Thank you, and that's correct. We can go over this as the area on the agenda about legislative initiatives, and as he mentioned, there's two that today we would like to, for you all to consider for your approval moving forward. If agreeable, I'm going to wait and cover those two last and just do a little bit of an update as a conversation about a few of the other areas that we would typically cover in committee. I'm going to talk briefly about Tier 5, briefly about ORP, a couple other ideas, and then the two pieces of legislation that hopefully you'll consider approving today deals with MDC and then paying off the unfunded if somebody were to leave PERS. As far as the Tier 5, I know we had a great deal of discussion about that yesterday, and we've had that before. And of course, this is just some brief commentary here, but we didn't bring that forward today. As you know, the board has worked on Tier 5s before. And as you recall, the board has previously voted and adopted a recommendation of a Tier 5 that was out there publicly last year. My suggestion right now would be, and of course, certainly happy to be responsive in any way you all prefer. I know we heard a lot of information yesterday. I think Dr. McCoy may have asked for some information. If he doesn't have it already, by all means, we certainly want to get that to him if that's needed after the meeting. Just let us know. But with that said, my suggestion would be to not do any more analysis independently of looking at Tier 5 or working on Tier 5. I would wait a potential Tier 5. I would wait and let for state leadership and PERS leadership, kind of going back to some of Mr. Breland's comments earlier about working closely together, but wait until state leadership and PERS leadership, which would include representatives from the board, to talk through and maybe discuss what are the potential outlines of what a Tier 5 would be, and then spend the time and effort and money analyzing and discussing and reviewing that, or wait until legislative leadership develops an outline or proposal and then do the same thing of that. Just as a suggestion. Be happy to do as y'all prefer, but that's what I would recommend. ORP, you'll remember from last year, we had a recommendation of legislation for ORP, and we certainly plan to come back with that again. This is the part where the participants, the employer contribution match, or the employer match, if you will, for ORP participants is tied to the PERS employer rate. And I won't go into all the details now, but we had the legislation last year to change that. We certainly still support that. We plan to pursue that same concept. We think there'll be interest and support from the legislature on that. But we didn't bring it forward right now, thinking that may be good to do in concert with a potential Tier 5, since it deals with members, participants, and rates and things like that. So even though that's not included today, we certainly plan to bring that forward again. One thing that has actually been brought up in the last 2 days in discussion that may be an idea for legislation, it was not in our recommendation, it's not in your package right now, but the idea of dedicating a certain amount of the state surplus funding toward PERS. And toward PERS is unfunded, similar to what other states have done, similar to what Louisiana did, I think, in a constitutional amendment. And I think Treasurer McCray mentioned something earlier, and it's just been brought up the last couple of days. So it's not in our package or notebook, but that is an idea just for consideration should the state want to do that, whether it be officially or by legislation. Lastly, another item that has been brought up in the past that we didn't include, but I wanted to, I guess, revisit it since it came up, is some method of an assessment or a surcharge. There's been discussion about the concern of those leaving PERS, and some discussion about a contract surcharge or a surcharge on privatization and things like that. We didn't put that in our recommendation to you today, but I did want to bring that up just for awareness and in case any board member on any of those items wants to share something or provide any direction. And I'm not saying you do, but I just wanted to make sure we remember the topic. Same thing for the legislative liaisons. And with that, I'll pause. The next 2 items are those that I do hope that you consider reapproving, which deal with paying off the unfunded for those that leave PERS and Mississippi deferred comp. But let me pause. Any questions on any of that other stuff first?
It's pretty well your recommendation that would do nothing.
Well, not quite. I'm about to ask you for something here in just a second.
Oh.
But in the context of Tier 5, I would say we continue to pause for a minute and let state leadership and PERS leadership, which includes the board, certainly includes the board, discuss alternatives.
I agree with us pausing. I would, prior to the meeting with the state leadership, I think the board ought to have another discussion about PERS. For instance, what the treasurer this morning brought up that we might want to consider is keeping, and I'm reading a lot into this, continuing the defined benefit but without the compounding, to see what kind of impact that would particularly have. Be quite honest with you, from my perspective, I really don't want to get into a defined contribution. I don't want to get into a hybrid, and until we know a little bit more about what the board would agree or to discuss, I would like to have opportunities for us to look at the defined benefit and see if we could have something that, and I hate to even say this, but if a hybrid were being proposed, how would that impact the system? And really, what we're talking about is trying to create a retirement benefit package that will never have a liability again. That's what I think is. But if we could keep the defined benefit, and by modifying that, it makes it so much easier, in my opinion, on a retiree. So I would love to have that sort of discussion, and maybe even, just my concerns about how much money would that impact, what you presented, toward the liability over time, and then a couple of other things that I would have. What happens if we go to 2.5% compounded? What about 2% compound? What about, as the senator had mentioned, if we vest, you get a 1% guaranteed, and then in 15 years you get 2%, and then if you go the full 30, which is what is Tier 4 is now, before you're eligible to retire, then you get 3. Just how does that impact if we modify the defined benefit in some manner? So that's what mine is. But I would just like to see more discussion on that with just keeping a defined benefit and looking at what the dollars look like to impact that toward the.
Sure, that sounds good. What I'm gonna do, I'm gonna ask Ed, just to recap that and make sure I get it, for example, for some additional scenarios, which would be essentially the current tier 4, but it would be with a simple COLA instead of a compounded COLA. And then we'll do the same thing with or a similar thing with a 2.5% COLA and a 2% COLA. Something similar to what we've done before, but we'll update it.
Yeah, I can't remember, and I don't keep this stuff for years.
Sure. Well, numbers have changed now, so. We can do that.
And that's all part of the November,
Sir?
that's all part of the November, I think, board
Sure,
meeting
can be,
that
sure.
we've talked about
Yeah.
is part of,
So now,
being able to do that then.
let's go back to what you were asking us to do right now.
All right, the, one would be the MDC. This is the same bill as put forward last year, same one as discussed last time or two, and it has to do, is driven largely by recent changes in federal law with adding a Roth provision associated with catch-up contributions. And then also, while we're in the code section, allowing MDC to be subject to quadros, qualified domestic relations orders. And it's the same thing, we haven't changed anything, and would like to ask for your approval of that as part of the legislative package for next year.
I'd make a motion to approve those changes.
Second.
We have a motion and a second from the board members. Any discussion?
That was just for the MDC?
Yes, sir, that's just the
Only for
MDC.
that item.
Yeah.
All right, if not, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries.
Thank you. And the next item is behind tab G, and it's the second piece of draft legislation, and the title talks about the unfunded actuarial accrued liability. This is the one that you'll remember us talking about the last couple of years. It was part of the package that went forward last year, and it basically, or it does, pertains to in that situation or those scenarios where an employer, for whatever reason, would leave PERS, for example, the sale of a hospital or whatever the case may be, that they would be required to pay their proportionate share of the unfunded actuarial accrued liability. So in many ways, the same bill that has been put forward before. But we did make one change. You see some of the changes there. I guess it's 4 or 5, page 4 or 5 in that particular packet, in the red up toward the top in the main paragraph. We did give some thought, myself and in particular staff on the business side as well as legal side, into some of the discussion, and I hate Senator Sparks may have stepped out because some of this is driven by one of his really good observations. And I forget exactly how it was said, but what's to stop somebody from slow playing it, so to speak, and trying to dwindle it down? And so we gave a little thought and have made a few changes here to hopefully address that. There may not be a perfect situation, but as you can read here, it basically is saying that they would be required to pay their part as of June 30, 2025, or the date of termination, whichever is greater. So should this be recommended from the board, or should the legislature pass it, it's the same concept, but it puts this addition in that that amount would actually be the amount, their pro rata share as of June 30, 2025, or whatever is greater at the time. So we think that would be a good step in the direction of trying to address that. So that's the explanation of that slight change, and we would ask for your approval.
Do we have a motion to approve the recommendation of staff?
So moved.
Second.
Second.
Motion and
The
second.
question, does that mean that if somebody quits, they're gonna have to pay to be able to quit?
Basically, that you don't have the option to necessarily quit, but if for whatever reason they were removed from PERS, let's say if the Board of Trustees terminated them through a due process with hearings and so forth due to failure of paying their contributions, then they would be liable to pay their part of the unfunded liability. Or if a hospital that is currently public and part of PERS, if they are sold or privatized, they would be due to pay to the system their proportionate share of the unfunded liability.
And if they choose not to pay that voluntarily, what would you do?
Well, this would give us better standing and better grounds and a stronger position to go after that money.
Okay.
What's it? Oh, by the way, this is employers. They're just to make sure, this is about employers, not the actual members.
This is the county hospital
Yeah.
goes out of business. Well, now,
Okay.
there's nothing to go to the county and say, we need to unfund it. And,
Okay.
and of course, it's still an uphill.
Absorbing that right now.
That's right. Other employers are basically taking that, pooling it, and
That's right.
everybody's absorbing it.
That's right.
Could you say again why it's the greater of the two?
Well, the thought being, it was kind of in response to, you might remember some of the discussion at an earlier meeting, on rather than an employer leaving PERS or having zero, if they just dwindled down their workforce. So they used to, they rather than actually leaving and totally terminating the system, they just dwindled down their workforce. So that was the idea to put in, we would capture as of a certain date. And then the reason it'd be the greater of the two is to protect the system.
Because you don't calculate that based on the people who've left?
Yeah, the way it's currently done now is some of the GASB report, you get, okay.
Okay, any other discussion? If not, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries.
Just a thought along that same line, but we had talked, where had some conversation about the privatization and the fee. You could, just throwing this out as a thought along the way, when you come back to that, you could actually use something like this versus a fee on privatization if we determined at a date that whatever the employer rate is at a date that the employer continues to pay that amount, or if they grow, they'll pay whatever they grow too. But if they start privatizing that at 25, 26, June 30, whatever, that they're still going to be liable for the employer contribution of June 30th, 2025. Might be easier than a 5% or a whatever assessment on a privatization.
Yeah.
So we're talking about, like in my prior business, if a school district were to privatize cafeteria services or bus services, that those employees who were under our system, when they do that, all of a sudden they've got to pay that liability.
If you had 1,000 employees in June 30, 2025, that's your baseline, and you're going to continue to pay on a minimum of 1,000 employees, pay an employer share of 1,000 employees. If you reduce that by privatization to 980, you still got to pay the employer portion on 1,000.
That's a good point. Or greater, if they were to grow, then they would pay them.
That's fine, but just as a thought.
Well, wouldn't be the employer portion, it'd be that less the normal cost, right? Or
Yes,
whatever
yeah,
portion
yeah,
of that
the
normal
unfunded
cost.
the unfunded liability.
Whatever that net is
Yeah.
between the two.
Yeah, if 3% is it, and 19.9 is it, 16.9, just a thought to play with along the way
Oh,
as
that's a
we
good
talk
point.
about that.
Yeah, I think that Bill, I think that any privatizations, that we should not have to absorb the liability that's already there. I think that the employer ought to, I don't be the cost to do a business for them. If they want to privatize it, they got to take care of that other. So, yeah.
I'm not proposing that.
Oh, I understand.
To go forward with it, just as a thought.
Sure.
All right,
Good feedback.
any other legislative?
Did we do anything with the ORP? Did that?
Not yet.
No, sir.
We're gonna
Not
come
yet.
back.
That was
Come
a,
back
that
to
was a
later.
pause
Okay.
too,
Yeah.
along with tier
We're gonna
5.
do it, but gonna come back later.
Right, but because of the tie-in with how that could affect what happens to ORP with a tier 5 that really is still way up in the air.
Mr. Higgins, any further matters?
No, sir, not for legislation, no.
Well, that concludes the legislative meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Dale. We'll move on to the municipal COLA certification for Tupelo.
All right, thank you. And there should be some information behind tab H. And I know that we've had a long couple of days, and this particular meeting is longer than normal, so I'll just be very brief. You'll see the information behind tab H. It is for the certification of the FY25 municipal COLA for the city of Tupelo, similar to years past. You see the information there. We'd be happy to answer any questions, but otherwise, we would like to ask for your approval.
Move to approve.
Have a motion. Is there a second to approve?
Second.
Motion is second. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries.
All right, and if you continue to flip, the next tab, there are 3 recommendations for additions to the Retiree Insurance Advisory Committee. Mr. Steve Allen, Dr. Kim Benton, and Dr. Larry Bailey. I think those 3 will be good additions. You're probably familiar with Mr. Allen, who's a long-term employee previously of Department of Mental Health in various positions, including some executive positions, and also active in MRPEA, I think a past president. Dr. Benton is a former, I think, interim school superintendent and has had a long career in education leadership. And then Dr. Bailey, community college president, among other things. And I'd be happy to answer any questions or provide more detail. But those 3 have agreed to serve, and subject to your approval, that's who we recommend.
Heard new member appointments recommended by the PERS staff. Do we have a motion to approve those?
So moved.
A second.
Motion and a second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Next, we have the Disability Appeals Committee.
We have 1 for approval from the Disability Appeals Committee, and you see the information there in your notebook and provided prior to the meeting. And we would like to recommend your approval of PERS case number 24-04.
All right. We have a motion to approve this case. Is there a second?
Second.
Motion and a second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, motion carries. And next we have the staff reports. Mr. Higgins?
And the first one of those is the retiree report. If you just continue to flip through your notebook, you'll see going through October, the payroll up over 200, the monthly payroll up over 214 million, and the total number of retirees coming in over 121,000. And in the interest of time, I'll just pause there. It's in the standard format, but we'd be happy to answer any questions. Otherwise, I'd like to ask for your approval.
All right, is there a motion to approve the report?
Move to approve.
Second. Motion and a second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right.
Thank you. And the last item is the investment report. And at the conclusion of my brief remarks, would like to ask for your approval of the investment report, as well as any trades and transactions since the last board meeting. You'll see this is a summary version of a lot of the information you covered yesterday, as Dr. McCoy presented earlier in the meeting, so I won't go through that. But I do want to call your attention to the last page of this particular investment report, which shows some information on fees. And you can see we always take that and watch that closely. It's around 105 million in total, which in and of itself is a large dollar amount, but when put in perspective to our portfolio, that turned out to be 0.31%. So 0.31%, which I believe is slightly less than last year. So just wanted to call that to your attention. And with that concludes my remarks.
Appreciate staff and their ever-present and never satisfied efforts to reduce those fees without sacrificing any.
Mr. Chairman, let me ask one
Yes,
question on the matter we just approved once before this. Is our monthly payout 214 million now?
That's right. The regular monthly payroll is approximately 214
Just
million.
recently, not too long ago, it was 173 million. So it's jumped that much in a short period of time?
It does continue to grow. I'd have to go back and refresh my memory, but it is, if my memory serves me correctly, it has crossed over the $200 million a month threshold in my tenure here and in the fairly recent past. Yeah.
Thank you.
Just hold on for a couple months. All right, any other comments on the investment report?
Motion to
Questions?
approve it. Motion to approve.
Motion to approve. Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, and anything else from the board? or-
That's all we have, other than the meeting is blocked off, as you saw through email, for, I believe, November 19th. So please continue to reserve that date. One thing I will say is a housekeeping change. I was out of town on business at the time I set that up, and it's been brought to my attention that maybe the conversion with the time change made the calendar block show 9 a.m., but our intention is to block off starting at 10 a.m. I'll send out an update to revise that, but November 19th at 10 a.m., and I'll send out an update. But other than that,
Put that on the calendar while you were in Georgia. Is that what the deal was?
that's right.
Okay.
That's exactly right, at the NCTR, and somehow it didn't convert. I'm not sure, but that's right.
10 to 2.
10 to 2 is what it was intended to be. Of course, we can stay as long as you all need, but that was the goal. The technology got the best of me, I guess, there in the translation.
All right. If nothing further from board members or staff, then we will adjourn the October meeting of the PERS Board.
Well, you already maybe adjourned it, but thank you, and thanks to everyone, but also we're going to be swearing in a new board member, I think, right?
Yep.
Okay, so
Okay.
definitely, if anybody wants to, can stay around.
Thank you. Hope to
All right.
see you all in November.
Thank you, thank you.
Oh.
Thanks to everyone.